Díomh Porta. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Leisha Moore. I'm Ireland's Consul General in Boston, and I am delighted to be partnering once again with our good friends in the Edward M. Kennedy Institute to bring you another virtual program. So those of you who have joined us before might know that our past programs usually feature some discussion around Ireland's relationship with the US, and it's a very deep and historic relationship. But today, for today's discussion, we thought we'd look at something a little bit different. We're looking at the US's relationship with the European Union and Ireland's role in that, because for Ireland, of course, we have a long and a deep relationship with the US, and we have a deep relationship with the EU too, where we are, of course, a member state. So for us, having those two deep relationships, it is, of course, very important that both the EU and the US together have a strong relationship. And Ireland wants to make sure that this relationship between the EU and the US is as strong as it can be. And we want to make sure, as a country that has deeply benefited from both the friendship of the EU and the US, that we can play our part in making sure that this relationship is as strong as it possibly can be. So we're going to explore some of those aspects today with a wonderful host and panelists. But before we get to that discussion, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, Caroline Angel Burke from the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Consul General Moore. Good afternoon from Boston and good evening to those of you who are joining us from across the Atlantic. I'm Caroline Angel Burke, and on behalf of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, thank you for joining us for this timely program on the relationship between Ireland, the European Union, and the United States. As an Irish immigrant myself, and someone who had the great fortune to intern with a member of the Irish Parliament right after the start of the European Union, I got to see firsthand just what an impactful relationship that was for Ireland. And I can appreciate the feeling of deep roots that connects the United States and Ireland that our Institute's namesake, Senator Ted Kennedy, certainly himself talked about. Senator Kennedy was, of course, instrumental in strengthening the Irish-American relationship, and the Institute is honored to partner with the Consulate General of Ireland in Boston on this conversation that we'll have today, made possible by funding from the Irish government's ESP program. I'm now honored to introduce our fantastic panel who will be discussing this EU-US relationship, how Ireland can play a positive role in sustaining it, and why transatlantic partnership is still needed in 2021 and beyond. I'll start with Ambassador Bobby McDonagh, who has been in the diplomatic service for over 4 decades, with 23 of those years spent in Brussels or in the EU division of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador McDonagh has served as the Director General of the EU division of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs from 2001 to 2005, the Ambassador for Ireland to the United Kingdom from 2009 to 2013, and most recently, Ambassador to Italy, where he served from 2013 to 2017. Next, allow me to introduce Tom Wright, who's Director of the Center on the United States and Europe and Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy, the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. He's also a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. Dr. Wright's expertise extends broadly across US foreign policy, the European Union, Brexit, and economic interdependence. Fiona Creed is the lead faculty for Global Studies and International Relations at Northeastern University. She began as a policy analyst at the EU delegation to the United Nations in New York City and developed that expertise into her PhD research on the often fraught EU representation at the UN. Dr. Creed has also served as the executive director of the United Nations Association of Greater Boston, a fellow civic engagement and nonprofit organization that educates students in diplomacy and global issues through its experiential learning program, Model UN. Dr. Creed has also served as a project lead and advisor at Solve MIT. And last but certainly not least, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's program moderator and great friend of the Institute, Dr. Robert Mauro, Director of the Global Leadership Institute at Boston College, which he founded over 5 years ago. The Global Leadership Institute develops and delivers high-impact applied executive education programming in leadership and strategy for developing senior leaders from around the world. The program has grown to serve over 3,000 individuals. Before GLI, Dr. Mauro was the director of the Irish Institute, where he worked with the U.S. Department of State to design and implement professional education programs for leaders in Ireland and Northern Ireland. We're so grateful to you all for taking the time this afternoon for this important conversation, and we're really looking forward to it. And to you, those of you who are in our audience, of course, we know that you'll have thoughtful questions during the course of this program. Please do share your questions for our esteemed panel by dropping them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And with that, I'll hand the proceedings over to our program moderator, Dr. Bob Mauro, to get the discussion started.
Thank you, Angela. I'm very grateful for your support and the work that you have done and the work of your colleagues at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. It's been a great pleasure to work with you. And it's once again a great pleasure as well to collaborate with the Department of Foreign Affairs and the consulate here in Boston on projects highlighting the Irish-US relationship. I want to thank the panelists as well for taking time, not only today, but in the run-up to this, to prepare for this discussion. Thank you very much. I would like to dive into this question, but just as an additional reminder, I would like people to participate in this conversation. So please do send in your questions and we'll work them into the conversation as we go here. As has already been highlighted, the role of the European Union is evident and important in Ireland. If you've ever flown to Shannon or Dublin and then driven to one or the other place or down to Cork, it's immediately apparent that the European Union has played a massive role in the construction of the physical infrastructure, for one, of Ireland. Or if you've been to Northern Ireland, you can see the impacts of the peace programs that the European Union has funded. Right now, though, it could be maybe difficult to see how Ireland plays a role in the European Union. The UK has left the European Union, and Ireland is now an island separated from the continent by a non-member. But Ireland does remain at the core of European issues, such as cybersecurity, multinational tech and data, and of course, the ongoing discussions around Brexit, all of which I think we'll talk about over the course of the next hour. I think it's important, though, for us to start this conversation reflecting on what the transatlantic relationship is. Often we talk about the transatlantic relationship and the relationship between the United States and the European Union as one in the same. So my question for the panel, I think right from the start, is the European Union an irreplaceable part of the transatlantic relationship? Tom, I wonder maybe if you have some thoughts about this. You talk about in your new book, Aftershocks, which is about the early days of the pandemic, you discuss some frustration developed between the United States and Europe around the United States trying to collaborate with individual capitals, and the capitals, however, delaying how they were responding and looking to Brussels and the European Union for a response. So I thought maybe you could reflect on this conversation or this thought here right now through your book. You know, what role does the European Union play in the transatlantic relationship?
Thanks. No, thank you. And thank you for having me as part of this terrific discussion. You know, I think the pandemic was a very difficult episode for the EU. One of the reasons for that, as many people will know, is that the EU is involved in pretty much all aspects of public policy except for health policy, certainly before the pandemic. So I think it was difficult. We saw a lot of problems early on. I think the EU recovered pretty well and had a big sort of jump forward on integration on the fiscal side in June, and then fell back a bit into the pandemic. in the autumn and in the winter, but I think it's come out generally sort of stronger as a result, and has sort of learned some lessons from it. But the point I really wanted to make, though, was more broadly to do with sort of the US and EU. I think the answer to your question is that the EU should be an indispensable part of the transatlantic relationship, but it hasn't been so, I think, because I think the US finds it difficult to grasp exactly the key role that the EU plays, right? And so in the United States, people are much more comfortable looking at NATO or the individual countries and those sort of bilateral relationships. The EU seems like a strange sort of actor to Republicans. It looks like a multilateral, organization they're not huge fans of. Even sort of Democrats, I think, struggle to really sort of grasp the scope and scale of the EU's role. And so I think it's very important, and we've seen some of this in the Biden administration so far, to really elevate the EU in that relationship, and to try to deal with it as an actor in its own right, and to recognize the tremendous sort of role it has to play, particularly in the digital space and economics, and in those areas where NATO has no real role at all. So I would hope that we will see a much stronger sort of US-EU role, and I don't see that as coming at the expense of NATO or those bilateral relationships.
Fiona, you've also kind of recognized something similar to Tom, that perhaps the United States has not taken the European Union as an entity as seriously as possible. But what have you seen in your research?
Yeah, thanks a million, Bob. It's more of an observation, really, I suppose, that as part of Northeastern University, we work on various projects as part of Diplomacy Lab, and it's a partnership with the US Department of State. And these projects are initiated, by various internal bureaus and US embassies. And what we've seen in many of these projects is a shift away from the EU and more of a focus on China, Russia, India, and many African countries as well. One of the current projects we're working on is an examination of the global coverage and perception of the US racial climate. And in this instance, what the State Department wants to examine is how these perceptions impact the US's credibility when it speaks out against human rights abuses in other countries, and ultimately how that impacts its ability to achieve its own foreign policy goals. So I suppose with Biden's administration, the Biden administration's emphasis on human rights around the world, its credibility depends on its own human rights situation, including racial climate and policies. And the interesting ask of this was, from our perspective, was that the primary interest from the State Department's perspective, what were the perceptions in China, Russia, India. We initially pitched the EU, and it was relevant, but not essential. And I think just ultimately the takeaway being that the perceptions of the US in China, India, and Russia is of growing importance compared to the EU.
Thank you, Fiona. Bobby, you write for the Irish Times very regularly. In one of your columns, you said something I think that speaks to this conversation here. You said that some British politicians, we might insert some US politicians, seem to misread the nature of Ireland's European Union membership. Ireland necessarily views the world through a European prism. Firstly, maybe you could talk about what that means and what the European Union means to nation states. And then maybe you could also reflect a little bit further on, how can the European Union explain that to the United States?
Gosh, there's a lot of questions there. I think the EU-US relationship is of immense importance. When you look at the relentless rise of China and the various threats that Russia poses, including interference in democratic elections and so on, the two most important democratic entities in the world who share so many values, the European Union and the United States, absolutely must work together. And part of that is to try to explain to people outside the European Union what the European Union is, as Tom was saying. That's why an event like this webinar is so important. Just in a nutshell, what is the European Union? it is an entity through which we share sovereignty. The bilateral relationship with the US is arguably the greatest friendship on earth, but it's a different thing from the relationship that Ireland has with its 26 partners in the European Union. Because in the areas where we've decided to pool sovereignty, we have a Council of Ministers through which we reach joint decisions, we have a common parliament, we have a Court of Justice whose rules we accept. And perhaps the single symbol that explains that perhaps best to people outside is that we also have a European flag. So when an Irish minister is making a statement or appears on television, he has behind him an Irish flag and a European flag. So it's not just an organization to which we belong, it's part of what we are. And that's why it's essential for the United States to, as the Biden administration is doing, is to interact not just with individual member states, which is important, but also with the European Union, because you cannot separate a country like Ireland or a country like France from their membership of the European Union. It's not as if we wear one hat when we're dealing with Brussels and another hat when we're dealing with the United States. The European flag is blended with our own flags. So in that sense, your initial question, yes, the relationship with the European Union is an irreplaceable part of the transatlantic relationship. And just finally, I suppose to come to your specific question, where I said that some people in the UK don't necessarily fully understand the nature of the European Union. Of course, there are many people in London who understand it very well, but unfortunately they have been sidelined by Brexit. We know that part of Brexit was a rejection of expertise, and there are immensely informed diplomats and public servants and politicians in London who understand it very well. But if you like, the regime that's there now is trying to almost invent a world in which the European Union doesn't matter or doesn't exist. And I think that's where I just think there's the risk of a misunderstanding. If either the UK or the United States thinks that it's possible to have a relationship with any EU country without at the same time taking account of that country's membership of the European Union as being an essential part of its identity, then I think it's misunderstanding what the European Union is.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think it's you know, an entity that's maybe sometimes complicated, or it's a complicated entity as well. It's difficult for people who are outside of it maybe to understand it. But I want to kind of delve into the relationship between the United States and EU a little bit deeper, and a couple of questions have come in on this. In particular, and maybe Tom, you have some thoughts about this. One viewer asks, you know, how has the relationship between Ireland, the United States, and the European Union fluctuated over time with different presidents? And I know you have some views on you know, how the current administration is handling its European policy.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think we've been seeing, I think recently with the Trump administration, I think we saw a big break with the traditional sort of almost bipartisan approach toward Europe. You know, before the Trump administration, I think the EU was coming more into US foreign policy toward Europe. Even sort of Republicans, I think, were making it a little bit more central, even if, as I mentioned before, they did have some doubts, you know, about it. I think they sort of, we saw statements by Lindsey Graham and others basically saying, look, if this is how Europeans want to make a bigger contribution in the world, then that's sort of fine by us. And what happened during Trump was we saw the reigniting really of a principled objection to the EU. And so we saw him and other senior officials really treat the EU as a rival. Trump famously said to Macron, the EU is worse than China, only smaller, which is like a double insult, you know, to France. And so that relationship really cratered. And when Biden comes in, I think we see a huge sort of correction away from that, a lot of re-engagement, sort of an acknowledgement of the benefits and vital role that the EU plays. The challenge now, I think, which I think they're grappling with at the moment, especially after Afghanistan and after AUKUS, the submarine deal with Australia and the UK, is how much to try to promote, you know, France's idea of strategic autonomy or a more independent role for the EU. And if that does become sort of an objective of US policy, how does that play in the rest of Europe, in Eastern and Central Europe, where there may be some concerns that there might be a dilution of NATO, and there's some reservations in Germany as well. So I think we are seeing a discussion now, and where that sort of leads, I think that's a positive, discussion. That's something we should embrace and talk about. And I think they'll try to thread the needle on it a little bit and endorse some of the principles, maybe negotiate over some of the details. But I think that the driving sort of force behind it will be to ensure that whatever role forces the transatlantic alliance.
Okay, thanks, Tom. You froze there very briefly at the end, but I think everyone got your point. Bobby, I thought maybe you could pick up on something that Tom was talking about there. He was talking about maybe these tensions within Europe and some reservations about the strategic autonomy of the European Union developing in the eastern states and maybe in Germany. How does Ireland play a role in these conversations? I know you have some thoughts on how smaller countries like Ireland make big contributions to the EU around issues that are maybe not traditional or big issues at home, such as security.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there are 27 independent sovereign countries who have pooled some of their sovereignty in specific areas. So it's not at all surprising that they disagree about things. I mean, they have proud histories and traditions and democracies in the same way that the United States has. So there isn't a natural state of harmony amongst the 27 countries. And what there is an agreement to work together in a single organization, but it's absolutely natural that they disagree or have different nuances on things like strategic autonomy. I mean, the European Union wasn't founded because the countries agreed on everything. It was founded to create a unique structure through which differences could be resolved. So there's a very sort of mature and open debate on strategic autonomy, which relates to many things. I mean, insofar as it relates to hard security and defense issues, there certainly are some member states that would be very hesitant to see any weakening of the NATO link. And there's a real debate to be had there about how Europe's security and defense strategy moves ahead. But in other areas, such as the digital agenda, for example, or economic issues generally, or cybercrime, or all sorts of other areas, the strategic autonomy is more consensual, even if there are detailed debates to be had there. So what I'd say is the nature of the European Union isn't that countries are put immediately into boxes to be counted as to who wants this or who wants that. There's a debate of accommodation and mutual respect. I mean, we've been in the European Union for 50 years, and many of the issues are decided by majority voting. And every country can be outvoted, by the way. Germany can be outvoted, and France. But in those 50 years, Ireland has only been outvoted about half a dozen times. And that's because there's a culture of accommodation and respect where everybody's point of view is taken into account. And Ireland cannot claim to be France or Germany. We're not the most influential member state, but we would, I think, legitimately claim to punch above our weight. And we do that by trying to ensure that we're informed, by developing our diplomacy. We're one of the few member states that has an embassy in every other EU country, because we have recognized for many decades now that if we want to be respected as a relatively small country, we must give similar respect to other countries. So Ireland uses its traditional skills of diplomacy and influence. We seek to influence France and Germany, of course, but we also seek to influence every other member state. And the European Union is not dominated just by a few countries. I mean, just by way of example, the current chairman of the Eurogroup, which is a really important group of finance ministers that's responsible for the whole euro area, the current chairman of that, president of that, is the Irish finance minister, Paschal Donohoe. And he was elected against a candidate who was supported not just by France and Germany, but also by Spain, Italy, and Poland. So again, it wasn't a confrontational thing, but it's only just to illustrate that a small country has a lot of potential for influence. And in the EU-US relationship, Ireland can also play a role, both in terms of shaping the European Union's policy, but also in terms of being an interlocutor for the United States. I mean, we're now the only English-speaking member state. We have a lot of, if you like, cultural and historical links and links of affection with the United States. And I think possibly the sort of conversations I'd like to think that Americans can have with Irish people, even just culturally, are on average a little bit closer and more relaxed, with more mutual understanding than might be the case with many people of other nationalities. That's not to say, of course, that the US doesn't have good relationships with people all around Europe, but I think there's something special about the Irish-American relationship.
Bobby, I think we'll come back to that last point. It's very important in a moment, but I do want to pick up on one thing you mentioned and ask you an additional question on it. You mentioned that the European Union has this culture of respect, and there is an ability for countries to come together. Do you think that is something that, I don't know if I'm using the right language here, but is that something that transcends individual political leaders? I'm asking because France is going to have a presidential campaign in the next year, and Merkel will be replaced by the new year. I mean, how much of those individual personalities, or how much does the European Union success rest on those individual personalities?
Well, that's an extremely important question. I think that at the highest level, at the level of the European Council, when the prime ministers or presidents of the 27 countries meet, then I think personalities count for quite a lot. Partly because, I suppose, at that level, it's the personal relationships that count for more, but also because it's something that the media expect. The media expect when the 27 prime ministers are there that they can get some stories out of differences between them that arise. But I think that below, if that's the tip of the iceberg, below the tip of the iceberg, there's an enormous amount of ongoing work and close friendship and accommodation and respect. Every day in Brussels, every day, even as we speak, there are dozens of meeting rooms where the 27 countries are sitting around tables, discussing legislation, discussing environmental rules, discussing agricultural expenditure, and so on. And of course, each country seeks to put forward its own interests. That's perfectly legitimate. It's not that countries or diplomats are expected to take off their Irish identity and suddenly start arguing for something that's European. But the way it works is that in the European Union, people realize that their Irish identity or their Finnish identity or their Swedish identity includes an element of European identity. It comes back to the flag. It's part of what we are. And so also Irish or Finnish or Swedish interests include an element of European interests. Because if everybody digs themselves into a deep ditch and fights to get 100% of what they want in a negotiation, they'll end up with nothing. So it's in our national interest to take account of a wider European interest. And I can honestly say in 30 years of EU negotiations, I never did anything other than pursue an Irish interest. But I was constantly aware that pursuing Irish interests necessarily involved also pursuing European interests.
Great, thank you. Fiona, I was wondering if you could take up on something that Bobby was talking about there when it came to security and the way Ireland is interacting across the European Union. I know you've done a lot of work on Ireland's diplomatic strategy, Global Ireland, and its role, not only in the European Union, but in other places around the world and within the United Nations. I mean, what role does the foreign policy strategy contribute to Ireland's ability to, interact in these worlds in the United States and in the European Union?
I think it's the Global Ireland 2025 initiative, the Irish government's strategy for essentially doubling its scope and impact, and essentially Ireland's diplomatic and global footprint up to 2025 has been fairly impressive for the most part. And as you mentioned, particularly not only with its relationship with the US, but also at the UN, where I think it indeed ran a most impressive campaign and managed to elevate, I think, Irish foreign policy as well to a very accessible place for people in Ireland to be able to understand what Ireland's role is in this multilateral institution. And with that comes in, I suppose, an added interest of what Ireland's impact can be. I think overall, Ireland's role at the UN, Team Ireland are essentially very well prepared, really highly regarded in the system. One of the highlights that I think is notable is their communication piece. I think Ireland's doing, not only within the UN, but across the US as well, it does a really nice job of using social media in particular to bring attention to what's going on and their various regional capacities within the US, but also going back to the UN, bringing attention to Security Council issues and highlighting its position as well in the public domain. And I think that's been very positively received. Picking up on Bobby's point, when the Irish awareness of its impact as a EU member, it's one of the things that's come up actually in its role at the UN has been that Ireland is not seen as being as good an EU member in the Security Council as far as pushing more of an EU position. But at the same time, Ireland wanted to carve its own course. It ran a campaign where it was very much so being strategic in so far as connecting with others beyond the EU group. And I think with that, there comes a comparison between Ireland's role in the Security Council now and comparing it with member states such as previous EU members like Belgium and Germany, who perhaps felt they had the weight of the EU a little bit more than Ireland. Ireland is certainly going outside the EU to ensure that issues of global importance, Ethiopia, for instance, is front and center stage. And I think they're doing a really good job at it.
Great, thank you, Fiona. Tom, I wonder if you might reflect on some of what Bobby and Fiona were talking about, but also some of the big work that you're doing right now. Your text, Aftershocks, is about the way COVID connected with the great power struggles and how that played out across a multitude of multinational organizations. So I guess my question really here is how does, we've heard a lot about how Ireland's influencing the European Union, how the European Union's influenced Ireland, how the EU-US relationship's important. I mean, how is the China-US competition important to the US-EU relationship?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if the internet connection is unstable, by the way, just let me know. I'm not sure what's going on here. I know it froze a moment ago. China is seen as the long-term sort of challenge. Asia is seen as the long-term sort of theater for US foreign policy. I don't think that diminishes America's commitment to Europe, but it will change it a little bit. It'll probably change the agenda a little bit. And we have seen, I think, especially over the course of 2020 and 2021, the EU really doing a lot to work more closely with the US on China. And that's not a containment thing. I think it's much more a recognition that the EU and the US need to work together to develop sort of rules of the road, to figure out how to have a common approach on technology, to have a common approach on some investment controls and regulations, and to think about what it means to uphold liberal sort of norms and rules internationally, albeit, imperfectly and maybe not as far as we would like, but to do what is necessary, especially within international institutions, to ensure that they're continuing to be, or that they are as effective as possible. And part of that, I think, does come out of the pandemic, because, if you look back to where we were in January 2020, one might have expected China to try to drive a wedge between the US and EU, to say that with the Trump administration that they were being the responsible ones. But instead, I think with the wolf warrior diplomacy that we saw in Europe, I think European countries did realize that it was important to have a unified approach vis-a-vis Beijing, and that was the best way of protecting European interests overall at the individual country level and collectively. So I think there is a lot of scope there, but as we saw with the recent AUKUS decision, there's also some differences, right? And the US is deeply engaged in Asia with the allies there. It has security interests, and so the EU and US will never see this identically, but I don't think they have to, right? I think the fact of the matter is there's enough common ground there to have a lot of room for cooperation.
Tom, a question has just come in from a viewer that aligns kind of with some of the stuff that we have been talking about in the run up to this. The viewer would like to know, what can the EU and US learn from one another as they struggle with major global issues like climate, taxation, security. But Tom, I thought maybe as you reflect on that, maybe you could start with the EU-US Tech Council, because this is one of the mechanisms that has been designed between the United States and the European Union, to confront some of the major global issues like data security.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, look, I think that we have seen mutual learning, like the US under the Biden administration has gravitated more toward the EU and particularly France in terms of the approach to globalization, right? Seeing globalization as something that needs to be managed. I think the recent corporate tax deal, which of course Ireland played a crucial role in negotiating. I mean, that was also an example maybe of the US moving more toward where the EU has traditionally been. And I think from the EU side, there has been some learning, particularly on China, as we just discussed. The Trade and Tech Council is a great, innovation. It brings together EU officials and representatives with US officials and representatives, not just dealing with China, but also dealing with the areas of difference between the EU and US on data and on privacy and on the role of the major companies and the need for regulation. And I think there too, where President Biden is on that is actually closer to where the EU has been in seeing these major sort of tech giants a little bit cautiously and as entities that need to be regulated in some way, whereas maybe under the Obama administration, there was a little bit more of a laissez-faire approach. So I do think we've seen some convergence there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, do you think, well, and this is for all the panelists, the Tech and Trade the Tech Council is the EU-US relationship, those are the anchors, but Ireland plays a curiously interesting role in this space with the number of US multinationals based in Europe and conversations around data security involving the Irish Data Protection Commission. I mean, how do you see Ireland playing its role in shaping these conversations? Is it going to be able to exert its kind of interest in it through these structures, or will larger states naturally have more of a voice, do you think? And I'll put that out there anyway. Maybe Bobby, you might have a thought on that.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say about the Trade and Technology Council, the EU-US one, is that the statement that established it refers to agreeing democratic and market-oriented approaches. I think that captures essentially why the United States and the European Union have to work together. I mean, democratic approaches, there's a hell of a lot of countries in the world that are not democratic, and market-oriented, because there's a lot of countries that aren't market-oriented. So I think it's a really important initiative. Now, how Ireland will influence it, look, I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, we're 27 countries. We're not the largest of the countries, but we're around the table when these policies are being negotiated. I mean, the European Commission in Brussels has a primary responsibility for trade issues, but it discusses the issues with the member states. And we're at every table where these issues are being discussed. We've also had, of course, very senior Irish people involved in the Commission in Trade. We had the Director General for Trade, David O'Sullivan, was Irish. So, we have the capacity to influence. It's like everything in the European Union. We have a bigger voice than we would if we weren't in the European Union. Because if we weren't in the European Union, these issues would be discussed and agreed without any Irish involvement. But we're there at the table. And I think not because of our size, but because the European Union is open to, if you like, intelligent reflection. It's trying to establish the best policies for Europe as a whole. So while perhaps the French and German voices carry more weight, I think intelligence and wisdom carries most weight. And I'm not saying for the moment that France and Germany don't have intelligence and wisdom, but I'm saying that on a particular issue, it doesn't really matter all that overwhelmingly how small you are if what you bring to the table is intelligent.
This kind of begs the question, and it's certainly begging the question on the chat line. I mean, is the United Kingdom missing out by not being in this forum? Bobby, maybe you could reflect on that a bit.
Oh, I love that question. Yeah, sure. I mean, of course it is. I mean, the United Kingdom was one of the most influential countries in the European Union, possibly the most influential country. I mean, the shape of the European Union today is much closer to what the United Kingdom wanted than France wanted. It enlarged to 28 countries, now 27. It created an internal market, which was a Margaret Thatcher initiative to a large extent. So it now finds itself outside one of the three major, if you like, trading blocs in the world: China, the United States, and the European Union. And there's no doubt that 27 countries, or ideally it should have been 28 countries operating together, can have more impact than one country acting alone. I mean, the United Kingdom has been trying to, if you like, re-establish the trading relationships that it already had through the European Union. And none of these give it better trade relations with any part of the world than it already had. But each time they reach one, it's trumpeted as a great achievement and great for British trade. And I saw Boris Johnson made a statement the other day saying that the UK is now set to, now that it's not in the European Union, to develop trading relationships in far-flung places around the world. But of course, that's exactly what it was already doing in the European Union. I mean, when the United Kingdom turns up in Indonesia or Tokyo, the local people don't say, "Oh, wow, you've just come and discovered us." They're rather quizzically wondering, why on earth they left the European Union, which already has very strong presences through its own embassies and through the individual member states' embassies. So I don't say that in any sense of triumphalism at all. Brexit was good for nobody. It wasn't good for the European Union either. It wasn't good for Ireland, but it certainly hasn't been good for the UK. It hasn't been, if you like, played up in the British media as much as it should be, because there's a reluctance to talk about Brexit. So when British, inflation figures go up, or when its trade to Europe goes down dramatically and so on, there's a reluctance after, I suppose, the bitterness of the Brexit debate in the years to, if you like, point a finger at Brexit. But I'm afraid Brexit does play a large part in that.
Yeah, maybe Tom, Fiona, you might have some thoughts on this as well. I mean, obviously, that Irish-British relationships are now at the center of these conversations on the European Union. Just last week, Chairman Richard Neal was here in Boston. He's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives, and he was here with Ambassador Catherine Tai. He was talking about U.S. trading relationships, and when he talked about the relationship with the UK, it was for him coming down to protecting the Good Friday Agreement and those relationships. I mean, one viewer would like to know, I mean, how serious, how much value does that carry in the UK and Ireland? And I think people have been asking this question a lot, but when Chairman Neal says that the Good Friday Agreement must be protected for there to be a free trade agreement, is that taken seriously in Brussels and Dublin? I don't know, Tom, maybe you have some thoughts on it.
Yeah, I can let Fiona go first because I came in last, and I'll go after her if you like.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I mean, look, it's very much so. I think stating the obvious, in that it's the protection of the Good Friday Agreement is very much so in the Biden administration's best interest, and has been clearly stated as such. So as I would see it, Ireland is in a very strong position currently with its US relations vis-a-vis the UK. I just don't see, and to Bobby's point, I think that there's been no winners, particularly for the UK, on the whole Brexit issue, and it's very disappointing, and has created an awful lot of noise where progress could have been made.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with what Bobby and Fiona said. I would just add a couple of things. First, I do think it is worrying what's sort of happening in London's position on Article 16, and I don't think the trade deal has the deterrent effect that it once did, right? Because what we're sort of picking up is that in London, they're sort of thinking, well, the trade deal is not going to happen anyway, right? Biden let Trade Promotion Authority run out. There's really no prospect of an FTA. So it's sort of priced in that they're not going to get it one way or the other. So I do worry a little bit, that that's not having the impact that maybe it had a year ago. And we have seen, I think, pretty interesting comments from senior Biden administration officials and the president himself, saying that there is a concern about the protocol and that the UK should not sort of unilaterally pull out of it, especially over sort of the ECJ or some principled, objection. Otherwise, they're sort of supportive of the negotiation on interpretation as long as it's done, consensually and through agreement between the UK and EU. So I do think there's heightened concern about it. And I think if we get closer to the 2024 election, we might see, if there still is a Johnson government in the UK, we might see them take more risks there. But the other point I wanted to make is I do think that, we all have our views on Brexit, and I would very much share the view that Bobby and Fiona outlined in terms of its sort of negative impact. But they have taken this decision and they've ratified it now in multiple ways, including through general elections, and they're not going to go back on it. And I do think there is a role for the United States in trying to smooth the tension between France and Britain in particular, but the EU and Britain overall. And I think Ireland does have an interest in ensuring that we get to some type of equilibrium here. Like, we can't have a full-blown trade war and real sort of political divisions between the UK and the EU doesn't help anyone. And I do worry that there's strong sort of voices in London that will be willing to see that for domestic reasons. And to be honest, there are some voices in France and maybe other parts of the EU that think it's important to make an example of the UK to show that Brexit doesn't work. And I think the US has a bit of a unique role in wanting strong relations with the EU and a successful EU, and also a strong relationship with the UK, and have both of those sort of work together. So I think you will see, and I hope we see, sort of an active role by President Biden here in trying to help smooth things over a little bit in whatever small way they can.
Could I just
sure, Bob,
add there? Yeah, I mean, I agree absolutely with Fiona and Tom. I think Ireland and the UK both attach enormous importance to their relationship with the United States. I mean, for Ireland, this goes back for centuries. To give you just one example, when Ireland declared its independence, but before its independence was accepted by Britain, the president of the nascent Irish Republic went to the States in 1919 and spent 18 months there during the Irish War of Independence, De Valera. That showed how more than a century ago the American voice was so important for us, and therefore it's deeply appreciated that President Biden and other American politicians, in a bipartisan way, are speaking up for the Good Friday Agreement, and of course for the protocol, which the EU is trying to and should implement flexibly, but which is the only way that has been found of minimizing the damage of Brexit for the peace process in Northern Ireland. But the UK also has always attached enormous importance to its relationship with states. I mean, if you go back even to Reagan and Thatcher, it's not just Democratic presidents, but Thatcher was constantly sensitive to anything that Reagan would say about Northern Ireland. And I think Tom is right. I mean, the trade deal with the UK is sort of down the agenda now, but I still think that Britain attaches enormous importance to the United States. After all, it left the European Union partly on the promise of saying it was going to develop the transatlantic relationship. And at the moment, the way that it's behaving in relation to the protocol that it agreed itself is not helping that in any way. So I agree with Tom. I hope that President Biden continues to play a constructive role, and not to support a victory for either side, but certainly to ensure that the legally binding protocol is fully implemented in a flexible way.
Bobby, do you, a question has come in here that I think that naturally flows in the back of what you just said. Would you expect a response from the US government should the UK trigger Article 16 of the protocol?
I think the more immediate question is how the EU would respond. There are good sounds coming out of the negotiations between the UK and the EU at the moment. I mean, David Frost has toned down his threats to use Article 16, and that's partly because the EU made clear that if the UK undermined the agreement that is reached for leaving the European Union, this would have implications for trade between the EU and the UK. Nobody in Europe wants that. Ireland certainly doesn't want to see that trade damaged. But I think there's a limit to what can be put up with. If the UK itself helped to shape the Northern Ireland Protocol, hugely influenced it, ratified it, put it through Parliament, and trumpeted it as a success. And if they were to, if you like, hold it below the waterline by using Article 16, I think the EU would respond. It's not something the EU wants to see happen, but I think the indications that it would respond have, if you like, made David Frost adopt, the British negotiator, adopt a different tone for the moment. But I think, it's not that the US would take action, specific action. I don't think it would, suspend trade with the UK or anything like that. But the influence of the US is quite big in London. The UK wants a good relationship with the United States, and that would be affected, the relationship with the Biden administration, if the UK acted improperly on the protocol. Because it's not just that Biden is Irish, it's not just that he phones up the Irish rugby team as he did the other day to congratulate it on its victory, but he also attaches importance to the rule of law. That's a difference from his predecessor. The rule of law is important, and you implement treaties that are agreed. And he also wants a good relationship with the European Union as a whole. So I think he's watching very carefully, and I think American influence is important, and American interest is deeply appreciated in Ireland and all around the European Union.
We only have 5 minutes left, and we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered everything from COVID, EU, US, China, Irish relations, and now we're deep into Brexit and the protocol. But I thought maybe we go quickly around the panel, just a minute or two apiece. Maybe Fiona, we could start with you on, what's the next stage here? No one can really tell kind of what the future is going to bring. I think even in December 2019, January 2019, people really didn't anticipate the pandemic most people didn't anticipate the pandemic, at least publicly, that we have now. So who knows what the future brings? What for you is the next stage of the US-Ireland EU relationship? And maybe we could take just a minute or two each on that, and we can wrap up the conversation.
Sure. So this has been a wonderful opportunity to participate in this panel. Thank you, Bob, and Bobby and Tom. It's I think that, look, from what I've been certainly following and keenly interested in is in particular Ireland's role on the global stage in so far as multilateral participation, and that stands at the UN. I think it's done an exceptional job over the last 12 months in the various crises that it's been faced with, and certainly its presidency of the Security Council. I think it's in a strong, or has been in quite an interesting and strong position vis-a-vis the United States as well, because on areas where the US may be more hesitant to touch, Ireland has been very well placed to handle. And again, I'll come back to Ethiopia as being that kind of example. And it's, who's to know what 2022 will bring, but I certainly think it's very well equipped to deal with what's ahead with the diplomatic corps that are in charge in that respect. I do think one of the other pieces, I suppose, is the biggest interest as well will be who Biden's political appointees will be in the various European countries. And I know Ireland's one is underway. I think that will be of keen interest in a more outward facing promise of a US foreign policy.
Tom, maybe you have some thoughts, and then we can give the ambassador the final thought.
Yeah, I guess what I would add is, I think as we look forward to the relationship in the future, a lot of what Ireland has worked on will remain in place, but I think there is a need to also look at new issues. And I would put technology sort of at the top of that agenda. I mean, we've already talked about the Trade and Tech Council, but obviously because of the important role that Ireland plays in hosting many major tech companies and sort of the role that the country has played in that, and including on the data side, you know, now because of where headquarters are for Facebook and others and Google in Europe, I think that has to be made more central to Irish foreign policy. And that's on the civilian sort of tech side. It's also on the cyber security side. So I'd like to see sort of a building out of that piece of it. We're seeing a bit of that, I think, in the Irish relationship with the EU. I don't think we've seen the commensurate sort of role yet in terms of that relationship with the US. So I think that's one area for a potential sort of deepening of cooperation in the future.
If you want me to come in, Bob,
Yeah,
I just make 4 quick points within 1 minute. First of all, the EU-US relationship is of immense importance to both, but also to the wider world. And I think under the Biden administration, the glass is very much more than half full. I think there are obviously rivalries on some issues, but these should be seen in the context of an overriding friendship. Secondly, Ireland can play a limited but important role in the EU-US relationship, both as a shaper of European Union policy and as an interlocutor of the United States. Thirdly, there's an urgency about trying to deepen the relationship because the Biden administration offers a real opportunity for that, which may not be there depending on who eventually succeeds Biden. And it's urgent also because of the issues we have to address together, including climate change, the rise of totalitarianism and populism. And finally, mutual understanding is crucial between the US and the EU. And that's challenging because democracy and multilateralism are complex, and the European Union and the United States are both complex. And that's where the role of education comes in. And that's why an institute like the Edward M. Kennedy Institute does important work. And that's why I'm delighted to have been invited to participate today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I want to thank all the panelists for their time and their contribution. I know you put some thought into your comments, and it's very important for us to have this conversation. So thank you for your time. It was lovely to meet you and to work with you. I also want to thank our friends at the Department of Foreign Affairs, in particular the consuls here in Boston, and the Consul General, Dr. Alicia Moore. And then finally, our partners at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for hosting this conversation and a series of conversations on these important issues to help us better understand how the United States and the European Union can work together with countries like Ireland to improve lives on both sides of the Atlantic. Finally, I want to thank you for tuning in today. I know it's lunchtime. It's a beautiful day here in Boston, and maybe the last one we see until April. So thank you for taking your time to be with us. I appreciate it. We didn't get to all your questions. I tried to get to as many of them as possible, and hopefully you can follow up with us. I'm sure any of the panelists would love to talk with you, but you can find their writing publicly available in many places, and I hope you will. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today, and I hope to see you again soon at another webinar in the future. Thank you.